The room went quiet the moment her voice cracked. Not because royals don't speak in public, but because royal daughters are never supposed to sound like this. What could possibly make Princess Beatrice struggle to finish a sentence about her own father? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notif. That's the question that stopped people mid-scroll. And it's the question the palace never prepared an answer for. Because this wasn't a polished statement. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't wrapped in royal language or softened by protocol. It was raw, emotional, and deeply unsettling. Beatrice wasn't announcing a charity initiative or honoring a legacy. She was drawing a line. And the moment she did, everything that had been whispered for years suddenly felt dangerously close to the surface. Here's the part that makes this moment impossible to ignore. Princess Beatrice has always been careful, quiet, loyal to a fault. She grew up understanding one unspoken rule better than most. Silence is survival. You protect the family. You protect the institution, no matter the cost. So why now? Why would the daughter who endured years of scrutiny, side eyes, and uncomfortable questions finally allow herself to be seen like this? Trembling, emotional, on the edge of saying too much. And more importantly, why did her announcement feel less like a confession and more like a warning? Those closest to the situation say this wasn't spontaneous. It was the result of years of pressure building behind closed doors, years of watching narratives be rewritten, years of being asked to stand still while the ground beneath her family shifted. And at some point, something broke. Because when Beatrice spoke about her father, Prince Andrew, her words weren't defensive. They weren't dismissive. They were heavy. Weighted with the kind of truth that doesn't come from headlines, but from living inside a story you never chose. And then came the moment that changed everything. She paused, took a breath, and introduced a detail no one expected to hear. A connection that, until now, had lived only in rumor, speculation, and aggressively denied timelines. A name that, once spoken, sent shockwaves through royal watchers and media insiders alike. That name was Meghan Markle. Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, this story isn't about proven facts or official confirmations. It's about claims, whispers, overlapping timelines, and questions that refuse to go away. It's about why certain conversations were never meant to happen in public, and why the mere suggestion of this connection triggered such immediate damage control. Ask yourself this. If there was nothing there, why does this revelation feel so dangerous? Why did Beatrice look like someone lifting a weight she'd been carrying alone? And here's the most unsettling part. Those close to the situation insist that what she shared publicly was only the beginning. A controlled fracture, not the full collapse. Because according to multiple insiders, Beatrice didn't cry because she was afraid of what people would think. She cried because she knew what was coming next. And that's where this story truly begins. She was never supposed to be the one who spoke. That's what makes this moment so unsettling. Because Princess Beatrice was raised to be the stabilizer, the quiet presence, the royal who smiled, nodded, and absorbed pressure without ever letting it spill into public view. If there was one member of that family who understood how to survive by saying nothing, it was her. So when she finally did speak, insiders say it felt less like a statement and more like a rupture. Let's rewind for a second. Beatrice grew up inside a contradiction. Publicly, she was the princess at charity events, royal weddings, carefully staged family moments. Privately, she was the daughter of a man whose name increasingly came with caveats, qualifiers, and uncomfortable pauses. Imagine carrying that weight while being told, over and over again, that silence is strength. That loyalty is love. That saying nothing is the same as protecting everyone. But here's the part most people don't talk about. Silence doesn't just protect. It corrodes. Those close to Beatrice say she spent years being asked to hold positions she didn't choose, to defend absences, to explain nothing, to stand in rooms where conversations stopped when she entered, all while maintaining the composure expected of someone born into privilege, but trapped by it. And then there's her father, Prince Andrew. To the public, he became a headline, a controversy, a liability. But to Beatrice, he was still her dad. And that's where this story gets complicated. Because how do you reconcile unconditional love with mounting allegations? How do you remain loyal when the ground beneath that loyalty keeps shifting? Sources describe Beatrice as someone who tried to hold the family together quietly, who believed, for a long time. That time in silence would soften everything. That if she just endured, the storm would pass. It didn't. Instead, the pressure intensified. Media scrutiny grew sharper. Public patience wore thinner. And behind the scenes, the expectations placed on her only increased. Don't react. Don't comment. Don't ask questions that don't have approved answers. So when Beatrice finally spoke, it wasn't impulsive. It was the result of years of emotional compression. And when pressure builds long enough, it doesn't release gently. It explodes. Her words weren't accusatory. They weren't defensive either. They sounded like someone exhausted from carrying a truth that never belonged to her in the first place. Someone realizing that protecting silence had begun to cost more than breaking it. And here's where things take a darker turn. Because according to people familiar with the situation, Beatrice's decision to speak wasn't just about her father. It was about a realization that certain connections, once buried, were resurfacing. That timelines people thought were sealed were quietly being reopened. And that if she didn't say something now, she would be complicit in letting someone else control the narrative forever. Ask yourself this. What kind of information forces someone raised on restraint to abandon it? Because when Beatrice paused, steadied herself, and prepared to continue, those watching sensed it instantly. The next name she was about to introduce would change how this entire story was understood. And once that name entered the conversation, there would be no going back. The air changed the second she said the name. You could feel it before anyone reacted. A pause that lingered too long. A stillness that didn't belong in a carefully managed royal moment. This wasn't the kind of name that usually entered conversations like this. Not here. Not now. And certainly not connected to her father. Because when Princess Beatrice introduced Meghan Markle, it wasn't casual. It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. Careful. As if she knew exactly how explosive even the suggestion would be. And that's when confusion turned into shock. Let's be clear. No official confirmation. No signed statements. No court documents laid out on a table. What surfaced instead were whispers. Old timelines suddenly re-examined. Private encounters that, until now, had been dismissed as coincidence. And a series of contradictions that didn't sit right once you started lining them up. Think about it. Two worlds that were never supposed to overlap. Two narratives the palace worked tirelessly to keep separate. And yet, according to multiple accounts circulating quietly behind the scenes, there were moments where paths crossed more than anyone realized. Events where attendance lists raised eyebrows. Conversations that didn't make sense until much later. And sudden shifts in behavior that, at the time, went unexplained. Ask yourself this. Why do certain stories stay buried for years? Only to resurface when the people involved least expect it? Those tracking the situation closely point to one unsettling detail. The urgency. The speed with which doors closed after Beatrice spoke. The sudden silence from voices that usually rush to deny, dismiss, or deflect. If this was nothing, why did it trigger such an immediate tightening of control? What made this even more unsettling was Beatrice's tone. She wasn't accusatory. She wasn't speculating wildly. She spoke like someone acknowledging a reality she had tried not to see. Someone who had finally connected dots she wished had remained scattered. And here's where the contradictions begin. Public narratives painted certain relationships as distant, brief, formal. Yet private timelines suggest overlap. Moments where proximity was downplayed. Encounters that were framed as incidental, but now seemed strangely frequent. And when people started asking questions, answers became vague. Defensive. Carefully worded. Isn't that usually where the truth hides? According to insiders, Beatrice wasn't reacting to gossip. She was reacting to information. Conversations she had overheard. Details that didn't match what the public was told. And the emotional weight of realizing that someone else's carefully curated image might have intersected with her family's darkest chapter. Imagine discovering that the chaos surrounding your father may have been more interconnected than you were led to believe. That the fallout wasn't isolated. That silence protected more than one person. That's why Beatrice's reaction mattered so much. Because she didn't sound surprised. She sounded resigned. And as soon as that name left her mouth, the narrative shifted. This was no longer about defending one man or explaining past mistakes. It became about how many people benefited from silence. And how much damage was done to keep certain connections out of sight. But here's the most chilling part. Sources insist that the name itself wasn't the real shock. It was what Beatrice implied next. The suggestion that this connection, whatever its nature, played a role in decisions made behind closed doors. Decisions that affected reputations, alliances, and the way stories were told to the public. Because once you accept that possibility, you're forced to ask a terrifying question. What else was shaped to keep this quiet? And according to those closest to the situation, Beatrice was only warming up. What finally broke her wasn't the rumor. It was the realization that silence had been protecting the wrong people. That's the part insiders say changed everything for Princess Beatrice. Because for years, she believed staying quiet was an act of loyalty. To her family, to the institution, to a system that promised stability if everyone just held their position and didn't ask too many questions. But what happens when you discover that your silence isn't neutral? What happens when you realize it's being used? According to people close to Beatrice, the emotional shift didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, in fragments. A comment here that didn't line up, a timeline there that felt off, conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered the room, and the growing sense that decisions were being made around her, not with her, all while she was expected to stand front and center as proof that everything was fine. It wasn't fine. The pressure came from all directions. On one side, her father, Prince Andrew, a man she loved but could no longer fully shield. On the other, a public narrative that demanded distance, denial, and strategic amnesia. And somewhere in the middle, Beatrice was expected to absorb the emotional fallout quietly and gracefully. That's where the breaking point formed. Sources say the turning moment came when Beatrice began to understand how carefully certain stories had been shaped, how some details were amplified while others were buried, how the timing of events was framed to benefit specific people, and how one particular connection, involving Meghan Markle, was treated as untouchable. Not because it was harmless, but because it was inconvenient. Think about the contradiction. A system that insists on transparency when it suits, and absolute silence when it doesn't. Beatrice reportedly started asking questions she'd never asked before. And the answers, when they came at all, were vague, defensive, sometimes contradictory. That's when the emotional toll became impossible to ignore. Friends describe Beatrice as someone who began to understand that her role wasn't just passive. That by staying quiet, she was being positioned as a buffer, a shield, someone whose presence softened outrage without ever addressing its source. And that realization hurt more than any headline. Because suddenly, the tears weren't just about her father's mistakes. They were about her own position in a story she didn't write. A story where loyalty had been weaponized, where silence had consequences, and where breaking ranks meant risking everything she'd been taught to protect. So when Beatrice finally spoke, it wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a decision. A choice to stop carrying weight that wasn't hers. To acknowledge that some truths, once seen, can't be unseen. And here's the part that should make you pause. Insiders say Beatrice didn't reveal everything she knows. Not even close. What she shared was measured, controlled, almost restrained, as if she were testing how much the system could handle before pushing back. Because according to those same sources, the real shock isn't what she said. It's what she hasn't said yet. And if even this much caused such visible panic, the next revelation could be something far more destabilizing. By the time the tears fell, the damage was already done. Not because of what had been proven, but because of what could no longer be ignored. When Princess Beatrice finished speaking, those watching realized something chilling. This wasn't a daughter asking for sympathy. This was a woman drawing a boundary. And in royal terms, that's one of the most dangerous things you can do. Because boundaries threaten systems built on silence. What makes this moment resonate isn't the rumor itself. Rumors come and go. What makes it seismic is the source. Beatrice isn't a commentator. She isn't a disgruntled outsider. She's someone who lived inside the machinery. Someone who saw how narratives are shaped, paused, accelerated, or buried depending on who benefits most. And that's why her emotional state mattered more than any allegation. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defiant. She sounded tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying truths that don't belong to you. The kind that comes when you realize loyalty has quietly turned into a trap. The palace understands one thing very well. Optics, control, timing. That's why the reaction to her words was so telling. Not loud denials. Not fiery statements. Just silence. A tightening. A recalibration. Ask yourself this. When institutions go quiet all at once, what are they protecting? Because the fallout wasn't just about Prince Andrew anymore. It wasn't even solely about the whispered connection to Meghan Markle. It was about credibility. About how many versions of the truth can exist before one finally breaks through. Beatrice's tears reframed everything. They shifted the story from scandal to consequence. From gossip to generational damage. Suddenly, this wasn't about what happened behind closed doors years ago. It was about what happens to the people forced to live with those decisions long after the headlines fade. And here's the part that lingers. Those close to Beatrice say she's at peace now in a way she hasn't been in years. Not because everything is resolved, but because she stopped pretending she didn't see what she saw. Stopped playing the role of silent stabilizer. Stopped absorbing impact meant for others. That alone changes the equation. Because once someone inside the system chooses honesty over insulation, the rules shift. Others start asking questions. Old assumptions weaken, and the carefully maintained balance begins to wobble. So where does this leave us? With more questions than answers. With a story that isn't finished. And with the unsettling knowledge that what's been revealed may only be the outer layer of something much deeper. If this is what Beatrice was willing to say publicly, imagine what remains private. And if silence has already cracked once, how long before it shatters completely? Because according to those watching closely, the next chapter won't come from official statements or palace briefings. It will come from someone else deciding they're done carrying the weight. And when that happens, nothing will be contained again. And that's the part people keep missing. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the signal that the story has entered a new phase. Because once someone like Beatrice steps out of the role she was assigned, the system doesn't just wobble. It recalculates. And recalculations mean pressure moves elsewhere. Here's what's happening quietly now. People who were never meant to speak are being looked at differently. Old conversations are being replayed with new ears. Moments that once felt insignificant are being examined for what they might have concealed. Not because one statement proved everything, but because it proved something far more dangerous to closed systems. That silence can break. And when silence breaks once, it rarely stops there. Those close to the situation say Beatrice's choice has already had ripple effects. Not dramatic ones you'll see in headlines. Subtle ones. Phone calls that don't get returned. Invitations that quietly disappear. Allies who suddenly keep their distance. These are the signs of a system trying to stabilize itself after an internal shift. Ask yourself this. Why would a single emotional announcement create that kind of reaction if there was nothing underneath it? Because institutions don't fear rumors. They fear patterns. They fear connections. They fear people comparing notes. And right now, that's exactly what's happening. What Beatrice did was remove the assumption that everyone inside will stay quiet forever. She showed that loyalty has a limit, that emotional cost matters, and that sometimes